Hi, I'm National Master Phil Crocker and welcome to our third video on double pawns. In the first video we looked at 14 different types of double pawns according to where the pawn was moving from and to. Then we looked at some examples of playing with double pawns, and in this final video we'll look at examples of playing against double pawns. So let me bring up some examples, all of which are saved in the Lichess study I set up. First example is actually the slightly odd idea at first thought of swapping off the double pawns. So what we have here is a game between Fabiano Caruana and Magnus Carlsen, and Fabi is playing white, inflicts the double pawns, carries on developing. And then what we see here is that because these pawns are actually influencing quite a lot of key squares, one idea for white is just to open up line. So A3 prepares B4, and white can open up the lines using this pawn lever. It's harder for black to really avoid the line opening, although black goes for some kingside play to compensate. And now, I mean, the pawns, black could have just got rid of the double pawn, but black has actually allowed a different set of double pawns, and on the surface they are even weaker because they're doubled and isolated. But what we see here is that Magnus actually goes on to win this game with the piece activity that he's got and the open lines. But the actual idea of pushing the pawn to b4 and then swapping was quite a reasonable one. It's just the subsequent play that doesn't work out in practice. So we'll leave that game there for the moment and go on to another example. So this is a more classic example of, we go back to the opening. This is a Ruy Lopez, the infamous Berlin variation, and this is a game between Nepo and Vidit in the recent candidates match, and I'll go through this very quickly. But you get a situation where, if you look at the king side, white has 4 pawns, black has 3, and if you can imagine all the pieces being exchanged and just a king and pawn ending, then white would, other things equal, have very good chances of winning that by creating a passed pawn on the king side. This one would be the obvious way, and then white can't necessarily promote this one, but can use that as a distraction to then infiltrate with the king, maybe to attack these pawns here and win thereafter. So this game here doesn't go to a pure king and pawn ending, but we do get to an ending where passed pawn becomes significant. So you see the black pawns on the king side, queen side. I mean, they can develop and influence some squares, but there's no real way for those pawns to have a chance of creating a passed pawn. Not if white exercises a little bit of caution there. I'll just go through very quickly. So for the moment it looks kind of fairly normal, right? But you see white pushing the g pawn actually gives a passed pawn straight away, so white now has that passed pawn. Black has lots of pieces to block it for the moment, but more and more pieces get exchanged, and that passed pawn becomes more and more important, and as we'll see, it's on the verge of promotion. That this is a mistake here. And that pawn is basically unstoppable, and the game ended. That pawn just goes through. So I mean, that could happen without the rooks and bishops. That would be the kind of king and pawn version of the story, but it can happen with a few pieces on as well. Another example, in fact, from the same candidates tournament is Vidit against Gukesh. So we can see this one in action. So again, a king's pawn opening, and this is a situation where you've got the bishops facing off, where very often you will end up with a double pawn situation. And here it kind of looks okay, right? The white rook is influencing on the line here, maybe the bishop also against this. So there is compensation for having slightly reduced mobility here, but over time white pushes perhaps a little bit too far too soon on the queen side here, and white does end up getting tied up with those double pawns. So the d pawn can move forward, but that can leave this pawn here somewhat weak. So the mobility isn't great for white, because if you push this pawn further on, then this e4 pawn definitely would be more attackable. So what we see in the game is that white does manage to defend the e4 pawn for a while, but that black can then divert the game with a second front, and black eventually breaks through using the combination of pressure against the double pawns on the e-file from the rook, knight and so on, and also the queen, quite nicely placed there. And over time the pressure causes white to allow a breakthrough. And the white king is in trouble there. So let's look at another example. Right, exploiting a weak square left unprotected. So this is an older game, and it comes from a slightly unusual English opening. And g6 here, we saw before that this EF construction wasn't so bad, but in combination with this pawn coming forward and leaving the d5 square weak here, this is a little more suspect. So what we have here is Karpov against Brown, 1972, an example of how to exploit a weakened square. So the d5 square is weak, and that is in part because this pawn doubled itself and lost influence on the d5 square. Also because this c pawn moved forward, and that can no longer influence the square either. So we'll go through some of the moves just to illustrate how that plays out in practice. So white can just keep it solid and focus on that weakened square. And this is an example where another example where the passed pawn is apparent. Black can't really create a passed pawn with the 4 against 3 on the king side, but white already has a 2 against 1 on the queen side. And against someone like Karpov, this is not a good situation for Brown to be in. And so often it's said that knight endings can be considered a little bit like king and pawn endings. So the king and pawn ending would be very, very good for white here, because white can just create a passed pawn on the queen side and then divert the black king, which has to stop the 2 pawns, and then white can just invade somehow the black pawns and then win on the king side. With knights on, it makes it a little trickier to execute, but the assessment is often very similar. white controls what's happening on the king side, is now winning an extra pawn, and the counter attack from black is too slow. The white pawns are too strong, and white has an extra queen, which is enough to win the game. So to finish off, we'll look at a more famous game. This is Spassky Fischer, and from the 1972 match. Spassky is white. It's quite common to get double pawns in a Nimzo-Indian setup like this, and the question is, are they going to be weak in that black can attack them, particularly the pawn on c4. Black might put a knight on here in some lines, maybe a bishop on here, so you get two pieces lined up there. So the white pawns can become weak, but maybe white can get some kind of play on the open line or on the king side in the meantime. So we'll see some of those ideas start to play out. And if white could open up position with this f-pawn castle, maybe get a rook pressure on this line, then that could all end up quite nicely for white. But black actually does an interesting move where black encourages double pawns for himself as a defensive and an attacking approach. We'll see that these pawns obviously are not mobile at all, and these double pawns have a little bit more potential, right? And now black completely blocks the white pawns. White does have the open file though, but black for the moment can defend that. Black uses his own double pawn to control some key squares, invades on the opposite colour, and white does eventually blunder quite famously. Queen c2, and now black has a little tactical trick. Bishop takes a4, and the white queen is deflected away from the defence, and the black queen can come in and hit the bishop and the pawn here. So it's interesting, both sides have double pawns in the final position. These two are completely immobile, but these two have a little bit more potential here. So sometimes double pawns are good, sometimes they're bad, and in this case we saw both sides of them. So hopefully you've enjoyed these examples on double pawns, and we will finish the series here. If you have any comments, please post them, give the video a like if you like it, and finally you might consider buying my book Better Chess Faster, which is available on Amazon. It deals with thinking processes, playing blitz, playing classical, and double pawns aren't a major part of that, but they're one example of how, if you understand a particular theme, such as when a double pawn might be good or bad, how to play against them, then you may be able to make decisions more quickly and more effectively in practice. Anyway, hopefully you enjoyed the video, and see you for a future one.